That little space at the stables can be magically transformed. It is really such a special little place.
Quite amazing, isn't it, that feeling of walking up the stairs and just thinking, what space am I going to walk into?
50 years ago, a scruffy new theatre appeared in Sydney's red light district. Audiences crammed into a corner room in King's Cross for a radical new theatre experience.
Some of the works we did in the early days attempt to shatter various conventions and preconceptions about what theatre was.
It became a place where audiences were just in reach of the action.
I don't want to be humble. I don't want to sit down.
You're right there, and people can read you.
And some of our most distinguished actors broke onto the scene. So how did this tiny theatre in the wrong part of town come to define a new Australian voice? And how much has that voice changed 50 years on? Before 1970, theatre in Sydney was dependent on English and American classics, along with musicals from the West End and Broadway. New Australian plays were hard to come by.
There's only one more train tonight, the train from Marseille. Perhaps you'll be taking it.
My parents had always been huge theatre goers, but my father got a bit sick of musicals and British and American shows. The Nimrod was doing shows here, and we all decided we'd go see what it was like. The show I remember was called The Roy Murphy Show, and Jackie Weaver was in it. I remember it being hilarious and being also shocking that all these people were speaking like Australians in a play. It was kind of unheard of. But suddenly this was the voice, so they had to kind of come and deal with it.
In 1970, John Bell and Anna Volska returned to Sydney from the UK after working for the Royal Shakespeare Company.
The theatre developed a new personality and maturity with the emergence of a new generation of theatre people.
John, Anna and a small group of friends set out to build a new theatre in whatever space they could find.
At that time, Ken Horler, who I was at university with, said, look, I've found this old stables in King's Cross. Would you be prepared to come and work on it with me? I saw the place and I thought, he's crazy. You can never build a theatre here. It was full of old car parts and it was falling apart. There was no stairs. It was a wreck.
I mean, we scrubbed the walls. We could sweep out the old bricks and the rubbish and the bits of wood, and people breathed dust for a long time.
The first play I saw in the stables, I just remember thinking, this place is going to burn down. This place will burn down and I will die in it. Because it felt like the whole thing was so rickety and going to fall apart at any moment.
I have a memory that you had to walk across a plank over the stairwell to get to the dressing room. There was no OH&S in those days.
I do remember this place not being soundproof at all. And when the drama got too kind of hot, people would throw bottles onto the roof to shut us up.
You can be performing here and there'll be a brawl out on the street, or some bastard will be bashing up his girlfriend, and everyone from the bar would race out and stop this altercation. So it was like Shakespeare's Globe, you had severed heads on pikes and bear baiting just over the road. It was kind of like New York in the 70s. There was that kind of, it was cheap, it was poor, it was rough, but it was full of life.
I think when Nimrod started, it was largely to entertain, but Ken Horler was a very political person, and he certainly wanted the theatre to reflect that.
A lot of those plays were concerned with the ugly Australian.
We are going to control every rent in Sydney. Nay, Australia.
Women starting to make their voices heard and rail against the patriarchy.
The only way to be an individual now is in the game. You're rich, you're on top, you're free.
And also one of the plays in that first season, Basically Black, trying to encourage Indigenous writing.
I've got a race of black people, and we can be anything we want. Tell me about it. Yeah, of course we can.
Those early days of the stables, they were progressive thinkers. They were people who wanted to tell the stories of Australia, and a First Nations perspective was part of it.
The final sketch lampoons the Gub, or white man, who believes Aborigines are innately unfitted for anything more advanced than boxing.
There was a good deal of shock from audiences in seeing this kind of theatre because it was pretty much in your face.
Blacks are up and fighting.
They're in a hurry, certain that they've been badly done by, and rather aggressive.
The audience supported us very strongly, but the critics, they were mean. They were really mean. They weren't prepared to be parental, cheering these kids on. They wanted grown-up theatre. Yes, the reviews kept saying, grow up, and we didn't want to.
After 4 years, the Nimrod had outgrown the stables and moved to a renovated tomato sauce factory in Surrey Hills, which eventually became the Belvoir Street Theatre. The Griffin Theatre Company moved in 1980, and with it, a commitment to 100% Australian work.
Theatre is about taking risks, and that's what I hope the Griffin is about.
I know.
What do you know? How?
I just know.
Over the next few decades, Griffin built a reputation as the theatre of first chances, unearthing Australian classics like Heartbreak High.
Can I go now? Oh, sure. Why should I waste my time talking to you?
Lantana.
But instead of going into his house, he crossed the road and threw it into that vacant block. You know the one?
Yeah, across the road.
Yeah.
And Michael Gow's Away. But this legacy would be nothing without Dr. Rodney Seaborn. He bought the theatre, gifting it rent-free to Griffin, allowing a new generation to front up and write about life in Australia, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
5 men appeared in court today charged with the murder of Sydney nurse Anita Cobby.
News of the arrest last night of Gary and Michael Murphy inflamed the anger of Blacktown residents. By mid-morning, there are at least 500 outside Blacktown Police Station, and the atmosphere at times was dangerously close to mob rule.
In 1986, Sydney was left reeling after the brutal kidnapping and murder of Anita Cobby by a group of men in Western Sydney.
So intense in Sydney when that trial was happening. People were talking about it all the time, not talking about necessarily specific events coming out, but about human behaviour and how somebody gets to that feeling.
Playwright Gordon Graham went on to write The Boys, exploring an uncomfortable truth about misogyny in Australia.
Once I started writing it, it really took hold of me. I wrote it very intensely.
I remember Alex Gagliardi, the director, was going to do a reading of the play for D Week at Griffin, and the play had been read previously at the Playwrights Conference and had been quite controversial. I hadn't played anyone like Brett before.
What's happening your hair? Looks like a dingo's breakfast. Thanks. How are you, Mum? Jeez, good to see you.
It was a really honest depiction of a family that is surrounded by violence.
I told you, just give me the keys!
No! If you want them, you're gonna have to take them from me. And maybe you can get your brothers to help.
Hey, you gutless one, you're just gonna let away, get away with that?
The Boys was extraordinary in that space is small. David Wenham had an intensity, but he also has a charm.
What happened to your hair?
So you've got this odd mixture of incredible charm and violence.
How it confronts you is actually in a really clever way, and we see it every week, women being murdered by their partners. We want it to be the lunatic, the mutation, the thing that is outside of society, but it's actually us. It's actually in our society.
Goes out of his way to break up a family just when it ought to be staying together. Hey.
Remember, we only ever had 2 walkouts, and they weren't walkouts, they were literally runouts, and both of them were men, which I've got to say I found really interesting. There was people obviously who were extremely, I don't easily use the word, but they were terrified in that theatre for that period of time.
The Boys was adapted to a feature film in the late 90s, with Wenham again in the starring role. It launched his career and continued to build the stable's reputation of discovering new and provocative Australian stories.
The Boys was one of Griffin's great triumphs, partly because of the life that it had afterwards. And I think that's one of the most important things about Griffin. A lot of those playwrights and writers go off and have great careers, and a lot of them started right here with Griffin.
I'm always going to be a black friend, aren't I? That's all anybody ever sees. I'm never just an actor. I'm always an Indigenous actor. Hey, I love repping, But I don't hear old Joe Bloggs over here being called white Anglo-Saxon actor bloody-blah.
City of Gold is my first play that I'd written and acted in. I performed that in 2019 at Griffin and Queensland Theatre Company.
I'm always the angry one, the tracker, the drinker, the thief.
I think that the things that I talk about in that show may or may not have been discussed before, but it's the way that I do it or the way I've said it, and I think that's what people had responded to.
I can't be fucked teaching the ignorant asses on a daily basis. I don't have the energy or the enthusiasm. It's fucking exhausting.
I saw it at the stables and it was the most amazing experience. Often a kind of highly politicised voice can shut people out, can push people away. But what I loved about number one Mayne's performance, but also his writing, was just how it pulled everyone in.
Silence is violence. Complacency is complicit. I don't want to be quiet. I don't want to be humble. I don't want to sit down.
When Mayne did that monologue, I mean, he performed it at Q&A, and just watching the shares and the likes and the millions it got to, you start to go, yep, you've just touched on something there. I look at someone like Mayne and think, okay, where are we going to be in 50 years from now? What is the masterpiece someone like Mayne is going to write in 50 years?
Between Nimrod, Griffin and Belvoir, other companies do it too, don't get me wrong, but those companies tell Australian stories. Back before they started, just didn't happen.
The idea of an Australian voice was really kind of fostered on the stage of the stables. What's kind of changed since then is a kind of deeper questioning and interrogation of what an Australian voice actually is.
Let me tell you what's an Australian, mate.
We're not looking for a single voice. We're looking for a lot of different types of voices because that is Australia.
I think we're moving towards something that can sort of acknowledge our past and acknowledge white patriarchal society and how kind of we've all been a product of that, but also kind of shift it a little bit.
On the way here, I looked at it and thought, my God, how much longer can this withstand the developers?
People have fought for that place for years, and I don't think the fight ever stops.
We wanted a theatre that would be primarily concerned with mounting Australian works, and a theatre that would be informal, a little more accessible, a little more relaxed.
I think it's really hard to conceive now of how little theatre there was in those days, that these young people, that they had the kind of audacity to set up a space, set up a theatre company.
They were the pioneers, those guys. That was the reason why I wanted to be an actor, is because I saw that stuff. And it was magic.
We just took one step after another. To talk about a vision is something that you can kind of see in retrospect. It was just one fun day at a time.